Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about the Natsuya Japanese natural whetstone. These are really interesting stones. They're quite a bit of fun to use. They come from the Iwate area of Japan, both the city and the prefecture, Iwate. This is in the northeastern area of Japan, a bit more north and east from Aizu, from Fukushima. It is really the only whetstone I'm knowledgeable of that comes from that area. Of course, I'm sure there are other regional ones that do, but this is, as far as popularity is concerned, the major whetstone that comes from that area. Unlike some other whetstones, the mines are distributed in a greater radius of the Iwate area, and there is a large variety of different Natsuya stones that perform in a little bit different ways, or of different qualities is maybe a more accurate way to detail it out. So today we'll talk about the different styles of Natsuya that you could potentially purchase or find in collections, the pros and cons statistically of jumping into those different types of stones. Of course, stone to stone for natural whetstones are always unique, but we can generally pull inferences that you are likely to encounter with different versions of the Natsuya whetstone. And as with the other videos, we'll do a quick sharpening and polishing test on the stone to take a look at maybe what you could expect if you choose to get one of these. So as was kind of briefly discussed, this is a Natsuya Nakatoishi, so it's in the middle step of the whetstone progression. Even within the Nakatoishi step, it is a bit earlier than other Nakatoishi stones would be. So normally, if we're comparing this to a synthetic grit range, we would consider it within maybe the 800 to 1200 grit range when using the Japanese whetstone grit grading. It is a fairly coarse whetstone in that regard. It kind of performs similar to an Amakusa Akai, a red Amakusa. Often, the first time I used this, and the way that I often refer to it to people, is that what I wish Amakusa was when you use it, the Natsuya is. So, frequently I find that the Amakusa stones are a little too variable in their grit, and they don't hit that sweet spot for me insofar as coarseness is concerned, while not being too coarse or not being mainly too variable within the stone. This can perform similar to what I would expect an exceptional Amakusa stone to perform as, but it's going to be more consistent in what its performance is. Now, compared to still a higher level Nakatoishi stone, it is not as consistent. It is still a coarser stone, so it has those the variable particles in it that are a mix of coarse and medium grit, but an Amakusa is really variable. It could have some inclusions in it, frequently has a very hole-filled surface, which also is likely to loosen particles that maybe aren't as broken down. The Natsuya is less likely to have the deep holes within its surface, and it just has a more consistent coarse grit. So it performs a bit more as expected across the whole blade when you're sharpening or polishing. So anyway, there are typically three different types of Natsuya when you're looking to potentially get one. There is what we'd call the gray, sometimes white Natsuya. There is the orange Natsuya, and then there's the striped orange Natsuya. They typically are listed in that order insofar as desirability or quality, if you want to say it that way. And we'll go into briefly what the generalized expectations of each of those Natsuya types are. Kind of a disclaimer before we jump into that. All natural stones are different stone to stone. And as such, when we draw these generalizations, it is kind of trying to say the statistical probability of what you would get if you reached into a large stock box of gray Natsuya, right? What would the average one be like? What are you likely to find? Of course, there could be exceptional versions of gray Natsuya and, poor quality versions of striped Natsuya. that don't perform to the statistical average. When we're trying to generalize or I'm covering a stone, I'm just giving you what I think the average would be. If you bought 5 of them, right, 5 of all the same version, you'd probably find 4 of them perform in the manner that we discuss. And then there would be one that is either worse or better than expected, and that's pretty common and matches my anecdotal experiences as well as many other people who are collectors or have processed many stones that I've talked with. So anyway, the gray Natsuya, which is usually going to be the cheapest and potentially the easiest to find, will look fully gray on its surface and have white splotches within it, rather large dots across its surface. It is probably on the coarser end of that 800 to 1200 grit range, but rather than being coarser, indicating the lower quality, typically it's that variable grit that we talked about. The gray ones are more likely to have different grits within their structure. You will find that they're a little bit more likely to leave rogue scratches, which are deeper than the majority of the other pattern. Not that that's bad, it'll still work for you, but it will require more work at later stages of your sharpening or polishing progression if you want to get those rogue scratches out. And I think you can get those for, in 2022, of course, prices change. I think you get those for around 120, a decent sized brick. 120 to 150 seems like what you can usually find those gray Natsuya if you can source one. Next is the orange Natsuya. They do not have these stripes, but they'll have a very consistent orange mottled pattern across the top. So it'll look similar in the color, but not in this design. They're considered, right, the intermediate quality Natsuya, a little bit more consistent. They could still have a little bit of rogue scratches going on, but I think that's more common in the gray, or again, white, sometimes people call it gray or white, Natsuya. To my understanding, which I've never actually had one of the orange Natsuya, but I've talked to a lot of people who sell a lot of these stones or have collected a lot of them. The orange ones are considered that intermediate level quality because they tend to be on the slower side of Natsuya. Well, if you consider the gray, the orange, or the orange striped, the regular orange one will be slower than either the gray or the striped. When you're doing an 800 to 1200 grit range, you don't really want to be having to stick on it for any longer than you want, because you're already probably going to be on it for quite a while if you're correcting the geometry of your blade when you're polishing. So as such, people tend to stay away from them for polishing work, because it'll just increase the amount of time you're sticking on that same stone and trying to complete that process. In that case, you might want to opt for a gray one and roll the dice and see if you get one that's pretty consistent so that it's a little faster. But, you know, if you don't mind spending a little bit extra time on the stone, or you are sharpening with it, an orange one could still work for you, because a little bit of extra time sharpening is typically, maybe you're talking 30 extra seconds, versus when you're polishing, extra time could be an hour, right? An hour or two plus. So it depends on your purposes. I think you can find orange ones for the 200 to 300 price range in a brick like this. And then you get to what people would typically consider the highest quality ones, which are these striped orange Natsuya. You will find that the gray, the non-striped orange, and the striped orange can sometimes be mixed. Sometimes in the sides of the stone or on the surface, you'll see that they go from one to the other. You're right, just make a judgment call based on what you've learned here about whether or not you're okay with that. The striped one is considered the most consistent of them. You can still get coarse striped ones or finer striped ones in that 800 to 1200 grit range. This one with us today is a bit coarser, so it's going to be in more like that 800 to 1000 grit range, but it sticks, well within that 800 to 1000 grit lane very well. It's not going to have as many rogue particles that could accidentally dip down into a 600 grit range, or it's not going to have an area that is really slow, maybe like an orange one. So on top of the better consistency of the striped ones, of course, they're usually fairly pleasant to look at, which also drives up their price a little bit when you're potentially looking to add one to your progression. The stones that frequently have these stripes in them that look really nice can go for a little bit more money, just by nature that they're more desirable for that reason. So I think you can usually have these for $250 to $350, which is getting pretty expensive for what this stone can do. You'll have to judge whether or not you feel that could be worth it for you. When you're talking about it being like an Amakusa, but doing a better job, being more consistent, but still on that coarser level, insofar as the average person, you might not want to look at getting something like this because you might be going over this grit range with a synthetic stone. It's not uncommon for people to work up to 1,000 or 2,000 grit synthetic stones before jumping to their natural stones. I think that that middle grit Nakatoishi range that's commonly ignored a little is wonderful to work on. But for the average person, these early Nakatoishi, I might say, if you already have a 1,000 grit stone, this is synthetic, it's going to be hard to justify, especially if you're going to go after one of these nice quality ones, a $300 purchase for something that will do very similar to your synthetic stones. I don't know if it's going to work any faster, but if you're a Puritan, you want to use only natural stones, or you're a collector, or you think it's beautiful, or whatever the case is, it is fun to use, and they're definitely effective. Whetstones, just kind of expensive for what they are. I think the average person might feel just as happy, especially if they're sharpening, just getting an Amakusa Akai, which is a little coarser, again, a little less consistent. But sharpening-wise, that'll get you through the same sharpening step, and you'll save $200 doing it. But anyway, let's take a look at it and see how it works, and then of course you can make some decisions on your own as to whether or not you would like a Natsuya. So again, every whetstone is a little different stone to stone. I don't find the Natsuya to be a particularly thirsty stone. I'll let the water just stand on there for a bit for you guys, and it is sucking up a little down this area. But it's, if you look at a Alto or Haka or something like that, which is really thirsty, and Igarashi will be really thirsty. This is not nearly as much. It'll let the water stand on it, but it still wants a little bit of that water in there. And as you can see, which we talked about, I think a lot of people look for these striped Natsuya just because look at how wonderful it looks. It has a really beautiful look to it. And I would be amiss to say that part of the reason I added it to my collection is because, it's because it looks nice. I'd be amiss if I didn't admit that. So we've let it drink up a little bit here. We're going to use a Toma 140 that's been used up a little bit. With these, earlier Nakatoishi, the 140 is more than acceptable to use. Of course, you get a Tomo Nagura if you wanted and get your slurry up that way, but this will work just fine for us today. So not much is required. The stone is somewhat self-slurrying. It will pull up a little bit of slurry without the initial generation of it with some form of Nagura, but I find that just that little bit of starter really helps to get the process going. So we did it. We're going to use that today. This is not a overwhelmingly finished knife. A lot of times when we do these in our other videos, I try to make sure that the knife is really polished very well before we jump into it, so you can see exactly the differences between a very well polished knife and the stone. But given that this is really on the low end of things, even though this is probably like a middle Nakatoishi, late Nakatoishi finish, I think this was done on a Toshima whetstone, if I remember correctly. This will be, you'll find that the coarseness of this stone is still going to knock this out really quickly. So I didn't feel it was necessary to spend a bunch of time polishing this blade up to give it such a coarse finish. You'll still easily be able to see the difference. So I gave you a little bit of our baseline there. One more time. Let's go ahead and work on the stone for a little bit. So you can see it's kind of intermediate fast. I don't find it's a blazing fast stone, but it's getting the job done. One nice thing is it takes quite a bit to clog up before we have to refresh it. You know, I don't even think we probably have to refresh it for quite a while if we keep working it. We just have to give it some more water as it dries out. It definitely gets a little thirstier as you go to use it, but that's also partially because it's refreshing itself. Maybe a little harder to tell on camera, but we're definitely pulling up stone particles. We're making mud. Not crazy amounts, but it's happening, and typically when that happens, you'll find the stone gets a little bit more thirsty because we're exposing those lesser hydrated layers under the surface that we wet down. But it's a nice feeling stone for the coarseness of it. It gives pretty good feedback. It doesn't feel overly gritty. You know, sometimes these coarser Nakatoishi stones can feel kind of unpleasant to use, or like they're releasing sandy particles. This one doesn't feel that way. Again, it gives that good feedback. It has nice control. It doesn't feel like it's releasing anything we don't want it to. And if you're comparing it to an Amakusa, or maybe a coarse Numata or something, some semi-comparable, a lot of those will do that. A lot of those will release grainy particles that feel unpleasant and probably give you a little bit less control over what you're putting on your blade's polish. Again, far less concerning if you're sharpening, but for polishing, probably a little bit more something you want to worry about. And the price over those comparable stones that the Natsuya commands is because of that. It's because it's giving you a little bit extra consistency and control. And it's a little bit like an aggressive binsui. I think most people would choose a binsui over this because they're cheaper and they're fairly just as consistent. But this one's a little bit faster, a little bit more aggressive. I'm definitely someone who's in the camp who always felt like binsui stones were a little slower than I wanted, or maybe not as coarse, not as aggressive, that's a good word for it, not as aggressive as I wanted. And this is a bit more aggressive. So if I don't want to use a synthetic stone, this does do a good job of filling in that step. But frequently nowadays I just work up to 1,000 grit or 2,000 grit synthetic and then jump onto the natural stones. I find the earlier natural stones are fun to use. They're a novelty before that 1,000 to 2,000 range, and this probably could do the 1,000 range for me for most of the time if I wanted, but it's a pain to really hammer out those rogue scratches that can happen from our Toishi and very early Nakatoishi. So even though this is, super high quality, it's not really going to probably give us many rogue scratches, as so many stones do. I just tend to go with the synthetics at that range. But you can make your choice, and again, as a collector, it's fun to have some of them around to just mess around with. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we were able to do. I tried to go a little bit longer on this video on the stone than in the past, because I've had some people ask me to spend a little bit more time on the stone. Usually I don't think it matters a whole lot because I do so much. Again, I'll polish the blade up really well before we jump on the stone, so you're not getting many residual scratches, but it's not a big deal to just spend a little bit of time. So let's take a look at what we got. So as always, this can be a little difficult. And this blade has a low spot down here, so I wouldn't fault the stone for that one. As with some of the other videos, we'll try an autofocus. That'll give you a better look. All right, so compared to a king, 1000 grit synthetic, you might look at what we just saw on the video and kind of say, well, that looks maybe a little bit finer than the 1000 grit. You know, the 1000 kings or your standard 1000 stone do tend to maybe leave a little bit more of a haze on the surface, but I will say that having worked past this stone onto other Nakatoishi, some of these scratches are deep enough to definitely be in that 800 to 1000 grit range. So it's a nice Kasumi finish. It's looks nice, and it definitely is ready for the next step after our work there, assuming I went back and fixed our heel, but that's just time we're not going to spend on the video today. But that's kind of tends to be some of the differences between early natural whetstones versus the synthetic ones, is that the synthetic ones, right, aren't going it looks as deep as it looks, versus sometimes with these natural stones it'll look kind of shallow, but then as you work the scratches out, you will really learn a bit more about your whetstone and how deep it really left them. So anyway, that's what we got for polishing. That's a pretty good experience, especially for a whetstone in that early stage. I think it performed very well. Again, the real stickler is the price. If you could get them for half the price, or for 50% more than an Amakusa, so sub 200, I would be recommending them night and day. But they just are a bit pricey for, I think, what they bring to the table. And even at this level, you could leave a kitchen knife sharpened at this level, but most people aren't going to want to. They're going to want to go to a second finer or even maybe second and third stone. So when you consider that's in that part of the progression, it's hard to justify spending that much. But it is a huge brick. It would, it doesn't wear very quick. It would last me a very long time. So maybe there is benefit to it. Again, judge for yourself. That's the point of all these videos. So let's go ahead and wet it down again. I think last time a lot of people prefer for me to get all the mud off. I'm just going to do that real quick. And this way you can see maybe a little bit better how it does on self-slurring. Once again, stone to stone, it's a little different, but part of what you're paying for at the Natsuya is that they're somewhat similar. So this should be a decent example of what you're going to get with the sharpening side of things and its own self-slurring capabilities. This is outside of being a tad coarser than the average Natsuya. Again, maybe most Natsuya are around 1,000, 900 to 1,100. This is 800 to 1,000, but we're really splitting hairs there. It does basically the same job. It's the average hardness was my point there, is that this is about the average hardness of the other Natsuya, and it should give you a decent example. So let's go ahead and take a look. I think a lot of the audio feedback sounds like it is a coarser feeling stone than the feedback through the blade. It is, of course, pretty coarse stone still, but it sounds like it's really grinding, and it doesn't feel quite that way on the blade. It's much more controllable on the blade than I think the audio feedback. This blade wasn't in need of any major help, so we've gotten our burr. Just give it an extra little bit. we're pretty good to go there. With some other stones, I might clear off the swarf we've generated and do a water-only pass, but with stones that are at this level, I don't find that you're going to get much benefit out of doing that. It knocks off the burr quickly, and it's not refined enough to give us really too much more legs on the edge of the blade. You know, we would want to move on to another stone at that point. So it leaves an aggressive edge, as you would expect for something in this range, but if you were looking for a minimum entry stone to kitchen knives, right, where it's just refined enough to start being acceptable, it did do that job. So again, around that 1,000 grit range, it did a good enough job to be usable. So anyway, that is our Natsuya Japanese natural whetstone. In case you can't tell, my feelings are mixed on it. I think if you go into it understanding it's a coarser Nakatoishi, not it doesn't fall into the Aratoishi line, but it's definitely going to be probably your next step after an Aratoishi. If you go into it with that expectation, and really, truth of the matter is, if you find it to be a really good looking stone, right? If you want that striation, you think that's a really attractive quality that it brings. It is, you know, it has other qualities which make it valuable, makes it very usable, but I think a lot of what you're paying for is looks. There are other stones that can do kind of the same stuff for you for cheaper, or maybe they have some more drawbacks and they're cheaper, but you're going to work those out in later stages anyway because of how early the Natsuya is. I have heard that, you know, of some people saying their Natsuyas are in the 1,500 to 2,000 grit range. I haven't seen many examples really demonstrating that on a polishing test or otherwise, but as with any of these things, you know, that's definitely possible. So if you're out on the market and you find someone who's saying, I got this really fine Natsuya, fine grit Natsuya, and it's, you know, in that 1,500 to 12,000 grit range, it's better than the average one, or my stock is better than the average one, what have you. It's definitely possible. Don't, you know, doesn't mean that they're lying. Just try to get some examples from them, kind of like what this video did, right? Get some polishing examples, try to get some swarf, mud generation examples, and see, you know, how you feel it rates up. But I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure there are exceptional versions of them. But so far, this has been my experience with it. So hope you found this useful. I suppose if you want to see more, right, do the normal YouTube. Subscribe, like, comment, so on and so forth. But otherwise, thanks, and hope you're back here with me soon.